How you going?
Really well. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Marcus. What you've accomplished is truly remarkable. So the brief overview of Nextsense is that we recently changed our name to Nextsense. We were the Royal Institute for Deaf and Blind Children, and we were started about 160 years ago when
Oh
Thomas
wow.
Patterson came out to Australia and decided that deaf children deserved an education, and he
Mm.
set up schools. The first decision of the board was whether or not to buy a cow so they could have milk for the children back in those days.
It's
Today,
amazing, isn't it? So what you're saying is that originally deaf children were just exempt from school, basically.
correct, it was the first institute, I believe it was one of the first schools in the world that decided to educate children who are deaf. And it
Isn't
wasn't
that
long after.
phenomenal to think that such a, now, I mean, that just really goes to show, because you kind of, there's lots of social concerns that we have and issues that we're dealing with, but it's great to look back sometimes historically and kind of go, actually, we are taking, we're constantly taking steps forward, and it's good to remember where we've been. The idea that a deaf child would not be able to pick up everything in school these days is just it's just ridiculous.
Absolutely. So it evolved over many years since then, and has incorporated children who are blind or have low vision as well.
Yeah.
In Victoria, we merged with the Royal Institute in 2018. So we were the Advisory Council for Children with Impaired Hearing, or TARALEE. We were started in 1968 when, in those days, a lot of children were institutionalised. Children who were born deaf were often isolated, taught Auslan, and segregated from society. And I'm not being critical, that's just, again, where they were at in those days. And our founders, mostly being mums and parents of children who were deaf, wanted their children to learn how to listen and speak. And as we know, if you can't hear language, if you have no access to language, you can't speak language, and that affects literacy overall. So I was just mentioning that one of our founders was fortunately a very well-connected person, being Janet Calvert-Jones, who is the sister of Rupert Murdoch. Janet's son was born deaf.
Right.
And so she went on a campaign with other people to bring experts into the country to develop and build a program that would teach children who are deaf how to listen and speak and get them access to sound. So back then they had big boxes on their chests with headphones. They were the hearing aids of those days.
Wow.
And it's evolved since then, of course, with NDIS and everything else. We're in an amazing space, and Australia has really the best system internationally, far better than the States or most other countries in terms of supporting children who are deaf. We're really fortunate to have a beautiful program of early identification with the mandatory testing at birth, which identifies the majority of children who are born deaf, connection through to diagnostic testing, which we do in Melbourne as well as in other centres around Australia, and very quickly getting them fitted with appropriate devices, being them cochlear implants or hearing aids.
Australia has been instrumental in actually developing that technology, right? I mean, isn't the cochlear implant something to do with Australian innovation?
Absolutely. It was an Australian who invented the cochlear implant. When he took the idea, Robert Clark, when he took the idea to Sydney University, where he was living at the time, he was laughed out of town. He came to Melbourne University and went on to develop the cochlear implant. And we were engaged with him throughout that process and supported that. And in fact, it was TARALEE that first started delivering therapy directly to children. We were the first in the world to do that, and really developed this system of early intervention. What Robert Clark didn't expect was that the cochlear implant would be so successful, because they didn't anticipate how plastic the brain is. They didn't anticipate that the beeps and bops that you get from a cochlear implant would be so quickly mapped to proper language. So when we see an older Australian being implanted with a cochlear implant, if you ask them 3 days later, what does their wife's voice sound normal? They'll say, no, I can barely distinguish it. You ask them 6 weeks later, they say, no, it's not normal, but I can understand it. A year later, they'll tell you, I don't know what you mean. My wife's voice has always sounded like that. Because that's how quickly the adult brain will be plastic and will readapt, because the pathways of sound and language are all there. With the children, they've got no sound pathways. They haven't developed any of that. So we have to take them through a 6-year journey of intensive therapy from birth through to about primary school age. And usually the vast majority of children by then have literacy, language and speech equivalent to their hearing peers. And in fact, their voice has no deaf tone. They sound just like you or I am.
Which is truly amazing, you know, to think that, because that you know, that sound that traditionally has been known from when people speak, that kind of slightly muted tone they get from not hearing sound and therefore not being able to deliver sound through their mouth in that way. To think that you can all but make that disappear is just,
Amazing.
you know, I went surfing last night to this urban surf place with these waves, and I was just commenting to someone how, you know, humans are just so amazing. You know, I've just been so humbled with just watching these sort of engineers and designers and people just doing the most amazing things, and to think that we have this ability to just bypass essentially a malformed or whatever system so effectively is just phenomenal. And you know, it's just amazing. And I think the thing that's challenging me about what you're saying, James, is that so many things that have been stigmatized, misunderstood, maldiagnosed, so on and so forth, all of those things, even now, you know, with children with, you know, we've still got things around dyslexia and ADHD and all of those things that still have quite a lot of stigma around them. Tourette's, you know, I was in a shopping center the other day and this guy was swearing his head off at the, sort of not at the checkout person, but, you know, if there was this very real, very intense dialogue going on as this guy was fishing through his change. And I was there with my son, and I mean, I didn't diagnose it, but I just said, oh, that can happen to people's brains sometimes, that their brain wants to say, you know, because my 8-year-old saying that we're not allowed to say those words, you know, and I was just like, it's just like an itch. He's got to scratch it, and he can only not scratch it for some time. But actually, you know, for that guy, it's probably pretty awkward for him too. And being able to, just as a person walking down the street, to understand these things and to have a normal conversation with your children about all of these different things that were stigmatized, gender, you know, and attraction, and being deaf or blind or having Tourette's, or this whole spectrum of how we're opening up these ideas to, this is just the spectrum and the diversity of life. And it really excites me that this new phase we're in, where it feels a bit clunky sometimes, you know, dealing with gender terms is something we're talking a lot about at work, and, you know, using gender neutral terms. And, you know, even just for me, I was talking to my wife this morning about how I just naturally use the word guys to explain a group of people, which is, you know,
those gender
really
biases built
sort of,
in deep.
Yeah, and I think that what you're talking about, I think is a really great, just an illustration from a historical perspective that we can get through these things, and actually we can create a world where, you know, those things are completely normalized. In fact, I'm watching a TV show at the moment where there's Auslan being signed throughout the whole show, and there's whole silent sections of the show. Only Murders in the Building, it's called. I don't know if you've come across that, but there's large sections of Auslan where there's no talking, there's no dialogue, it's all subtitled, because the characters are just having a chat with each other, and there's they put a sort of a soundscape on it. Anyway, it's just, you know, this has just become part of our normal vernacular. Yeah, you should check it out if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, thank you.
Look,
And we're still learning so much. We recently had a presentation from a researcher at Vic Uni who was having an in-depth study into ADHD and those sorts of conditions and the link to hearing. And so what we know is that a child who's born deaf has a higher risk of having those other conditions or those challenges in their life. And it was interesting because a lot of educators and people will say, gosh, the number of kids with these conditions is growing and growing and growing. Gosh, what's that about? And the researcher was showing us that when they look at data over the last 20 years, they actually see the number of people with a mental diagnosis or a generalistic diagnosis of being mentally disabled or mentally impaired in some way is falling, and the number of kids being diagnosed properly with some sort of ADHD or condition in that way, some form of the autism spectrum, is growing. So what we're seeing is the number of people or children with some sort of that diagnosis is actually stable, but instead of having this generic term of being challenged, we're actually getting more correct diagnosis, which is making a huge
and that's right. We're not using these terms like slow and retarded and these sort of generic terms, and we're starting. It's just the process of human evolution where we're starting to understand more fine-grained detail, and the more we do that, the better. It just interests me that the pushback that you get in society, you see of people going, we're never going to understand these things, or these people need to be excluded because they're not part of our tribe, or they're causing, and actually when people are understood and they're given the tools that they need, they become active, crucial members of society that give us a perspective on life that otherwise we wouldn't have. It's such a privilege. So it's really great. Look, James, the other reason James, the other reason I wanted to give you a call is that actually this is not an interview, but we've actually selected you to get one of the Rovers. You're going to be one of the two organisations out of the huge number of applications we've had. And the reason for that is we particularly wanted to focus on a centre like yours that was doing great work with children with different abilities, because the Nüdel Rover, even though it's great for early childhood and primary sort of centres in general, we really wanted to get it out to some groups that had a focus on particular abilities, and to really just sort of see the interesting ways in that they would use that as professionals in those areas to support children with the lagging skills they might have, and just sort of see them thrive in that open-ended, child-directed environment. So we actually, when we got your application, you were shortlisted straight away, and we couldn't be more excited to be getting that to you.
That's super exciting, thank you. And I was speaking to our occupational therapist who actually rang me and said, James, we've got to find a way, we've got to try to apply, we've got to see if we can get this cart, because we know that our children, again, more recent discoveries and more recent therapy is discovering that children who are deaf often have impacted on their balance systems, and that often is misdiagnosed. They're just clumsy, they're just kids that bounce into walls, they just trip over a bit, and actually...
Or they're just blind, right? I mean, you could easily justify that by just saying they're blind, they didn't see the wall, right? But that's a misunderstanding, I assume, of what's going on, right?
Particularly for children who are deaf, it's a misunderstanding. So now we're implementing screening processes for all the clients on our service, so that where every child's being screened for any OT issues, we're starting these school holiday intensive OT opportunities where we can get kids in for a couple of days and put them through processes. Things that preschools and kinders and preps have stopped doing are things like dancing. There's not much dancing anymore in school. We're seeing much less free-form art and drawing in school. We're seeing a lot less of these fine motor skills in school because they're really pushing towards a curriculum. They're really pushing towards more formalized learning, which is important. But what it takes away, and particularly over COVID years of reduced schooling, is it takes away all that motor development that has been so vital in those early years. And we see
actually, I think it's just, I'll be more blunt than you. I think that's a complete error of judgment. All of those things, like the arts, build towards our fundamental skill base, which is a holistic thing. It's not some compartmentalized, blocked up subject by subject thing. The fact that we've chosen those 4 subjects is that they are an important part of the organic mix of things that we need to know, and the way of, literacy and numeracy are ways of translating life. But the idea that these things should be learned in a silo without the arts and without those other things, which are the things that make us human, I think is foolish, to be polite, and ludicrous on the other end. It's just crazy. I think you've been quite polite, James.
Well, I also think we get our ethics from art, right? We get that's our historical storytelling. It sets the context of our culture and encourages really young children to be critical and analyze what they're learning and what they're seeing through body movement and through participation. And we just know that in worlds where there's no longer a primary caregiver at home because they're off at work, and in these environments we see so much less natural play and movement at home and in childcare and in kindergarten, and there's real negatives for that, especially for children who are deaf. And
I think that OTs are really the unsung heroes in a lot of all this. I went through a stage about a year ago. I think I just completely fell in love with just OTs. They have this way of understanding human beings, which I think if all of us could try and get our heads around, this idea of saying, okay, everyone's okay. You're all okay in your current position, and I'm going to support you to be more okay by really, really deeply and empathically thinking about who you are and what you might need, and then kind of working from there. I think we could all learn a lot from that perspective. But to pick up on something else you just said, James, that I thought was really interesting, is that so I'm the product designer of the Nüdel cart with another incredible colleague, Emma Ribbons. But through that process, for me, the amount of literacy and numeracy embedded within the process of that very highly creative and artistic design process is intense. Like the way that the holes work, the way that everything has to fit together, the way that we had to use the CNC machine, which is essentially a numeric machine, and we have to translate our very artistic ideas into something that works. The idea that the arts and scratching shapes and fitting things across a page are not related to literacy and numeracy, and the conversations that go around art, music is mathematical as well. So the idea that these things are somehow connected, again, is just silly. It is just a silly, immature understanding of how the brain learns and how people pick up the important things of life. And I think that because the education system is one of the biggest systems in the world, it is just such a juggernaut to change. And unfortunately, we made some very poor choices during the Industrial Revolution, and we are still suffering under that same mindset today, to try and get out of that and take a more organic human. And I would say organic because humans are organic. Our brains are these fleshy, oblong, squishy, fatty objects. They are not rectangular, fixed, curriculum, text-based. They don't function in that way. And it's just a silly idea for us to put that overlay onto this organic mass that is humanity. It's just downright silly. Yeah,
absolutely. Marcus, we'd love to offer as well, if you're interested, to see if we can film any of our work with the cart, if we can, if any of that would be helpful, if it can support your
absolutely.
promotion,
Yeah,
other
so we are
activities.
producing an OT manual right now, actually.
Great.
And one thing I would love is your feedback, particularly from your OTs, but your team's feedback on that manual and how your centre and what you learn might be included in that would be absolutely amazing. Without a doubt, that would be an incredible privilege for us to get that feedback loop happening, and anything that we can share with people about what's working, what you've learnt, and how you're using it in your practice is something we would be, when we've got quite a big network of people through both Playground Ideas and Nüdel, to share. That would be great.
Right.
Sorry.
Our OT's super experienced. She's had many years in the field, and absolutely knows. She's already knows what she wants to do with it. Any manual or support documentation you can send will be great, and she'll be thrilled to review that and give you any feedback. One of our uses of the machine, the Nüdel, will also be social skills. So we know that children who are deaf miss on all those cues that normal kids hear when they hear their parents saying please and thank you, when they learn about turn taking and all those really important social clues that hearing children just naturally pick up on. A lot of children who are deaf miss that. So prior to primary school, we have this big focus not only on the movement and OT and balance and motor skills, but on social skills, and being able to get the kids in a small group team to actually collaborate to achieve a goal of building a particular outcome or design using the Nüdel cart actually has a huge benefit in the work that we do. So that'll be another way we'll activate it in our groups.
Sounds great. I mean, that's what it's perfect what it's for. So just so you know where we're up to, obviously we're in production right now. I wanted to I've literally just, I don't know if you can see, but this is a Nüdel cart right here. This is the very first production ready Nüdel Rover that's come off the line. I literally got it in the box and I put it together yesterday, and it's gone together perfectly, which is great. So we've made I think about 50 of them so far, so they're really coming off the line now, and then we'll be getting them out in first term next year, and you'll be one of the first tranche to get one. So
thank you.
Super exciting. If you can connect me with your OT, that'd be great.
Absolutely.
And yeah, so we've got to head off, but it's been great, and I just cannot wait to see how you guys use it, and and get some feedback from you. I'm really excited.
Absolutely, no problems, and we're very grateful. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right, thanks, James. And I just want to, just because we're recording, the last thing I want to say is I want to thank the Brunswick, particularly the Brunswick Neighbourhood Network, which is an amazing Facebook group of about I don't know, I think it's maybe 40,000 people, but them, and then another company called Vativ, that's a sort of a training organization, through them mainly, and then obviously the amazing people in the Playground Ideas Nüdel cart sort of community. Essentially this cart is being donated just from that community upwelling of people buying tiny packs of sunflower seeds, which have enabled us to donate that to you. So thanks. Just want to recognize those guys that I think there was Rebecca, do you remember the numbers? Was it over 1,000 or something like that? I'm trying to remember. No, it must have been in the hundreds.
I don't remember this year actually. How many?
Anyway, definitely hundreds, if not thousands of people bought packets of sunflower seeds, sold them to their neighbours, and have enabled us to raise enough funds to give away carts, which is fantastic. So lovely to meet you, James. Can't wait to see what you guys do, and looking forward to get in touch anytime. You've got my email. It'd be great to chat sometime later once you've got it. All right.
Fantastic.
Talk
Thanks
soon.
again.
Thanks.
All the best. Ciao.
Bye-bye.